Well, it's wonderful to be here with you today, Richard. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be talking about high-performing organizations based on ethics, integrity, compliance, and of course, your own story and your own brilliant work. You are the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery LLC, an acclaimed speaker, author, facilitator, consultant to brilliant organizations all around the world. Your work and story have been featured in the best places, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and many more. And you're an author to yourself, including your recent work in Fast Company and plenty more to come, I know, in that area. So as I said, we're going to be talking about how to create these high-performing organizations and what leaders specifically can do to encourage it, role model it, incentivize it. And we're also going to delve into your own story from corruption to compliance to eminence and brilliance. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Well, thank you, David. And I think if there's any part of this journey that leads to eminence and brilliance, it's being on Lansfield on the Line. So thank you very much.
Okay, we should finish it here. That's enough for me. No, that's fantastic. Wonderful. And that wasn't rehearsed. So come on, let's delve in before I start blushing. So many of our clients, you and I, have purpose statements. They have codes of conduct, values, and they know that compliance is necessary, particularly in the context they're facing. But still, these problems come up. If you read the newspapers, they're full of ethical lapses by CEOs and their teams. So just paint the picture as we get started for what gets wrong, what goes wrong, and what did they get wrong?
It's a great point, David. And we just need to go to any multinational website to look at these wonderful aspirational values and mission and purpose. So I guess the question is, why aren't they getting operationalized? And I think there are two primary pillars of that. One is that over the course of the last, let's say, even 5 years, most multinationals have built robust, well-resourced ethics and compliance frameworks, whether that's e-learning, training, education, due diligence, or onboarding. The programs are there. But where I think we're caught in a little bit of ethics and compliance mud, so to speak, is we're not getting our business leaders to take them as seriously as the compliance leaders are. And the business leaders are still looking at this as well. That's a support function. That's why we have these teams. So when my clients often ask me, what's your definition of ethics and compliance? It's those teams are there to help their business peers have a balanced mindset between risk and innovation. They are there to help their business teams make good, ethical, responsible decisions, but they are not there to make the decisions.
Right. Yes.
So I think this transfer is going a little bit slower than we would like to see it. And I think the other pillar, David, is that even where business peers and business leaders are taking it seriously, it's getting a bit frozen in the middle at that level of middle level management, because those are the teams and the people that control the volume of getting the business done and the importance of how business gets done. And they can take wonderful tone at the top and aspirational values, and they can make them stronger as they head to the front lines of operations, or they can discard or dilute those messages, not because they want to do anything wrong, but just to the needs of business growth. So I think we really need to look at the middle level band of organizations and make sure that they're keeping that volume strong all the way to the front lines of operations.
That's crystal clear. We've talked about mud, though, and we've talked about frozen middle already. Brilliant, memorable phrases. So let's dig deep into, you talked about the tone from the top there, and then selling, I guess, compliance to the organization. Because I guess a number of, whether it's the middle managers or the other executives, will think, yeah, I need to do it, but I've got targets to hit as well. What have you seen that works when people, if you like, enable compliance in a very integrated way? How do they sell it?
Well, ultimately, they're selling it as a partner to business success and business growth. But that will not happen on its own. I think there is really a a top down and a bottom up need to have proactive outreach, active communications to where business leaders, again, I'm talking about the voice of business,
Mm.
reaching out to their teams. And this is something that Amy Edmondson talks about in her work, The Fearless Organization, and just asking open-ended questions like, how can I help you? We're facing so many emerging risks as well as stubborn ones. Are we missing anything?
Yes.
What are you up against? And the more we're asking our teams for that information, and it doesn't have to be a global survey, it could just be a mini pulse, and to say, what are the tools that we need to make sure that you are successful and safe? And that's not a one and done exercise, David. But the more we send out those messages, the more we're reducing the risk of sending out mixed signals to where people will ultimately appreciate, I know how my organization defines success, and it's with one voice. And they really do care about not only my financial success, but also my safety and getting the job done the right way.
Yes. I love that, success and safety. And ultimately, you want to build a culture where people can figure it out themselves and obviously go to the experts when they need to, as opposed to being policed, if you like.
Perfectly
We've
said.
seen many organizations distribute more responsibility and accountability to the edges of the organization, and many employees want it. They want to have more autonomy to do their work, to craft their work in their own way. Comes up in many surveys and many conversations that I've had. That carries risks, right, in terms of compliance. So how do you can't get away from that trend in many organizations, but how does your compliance approach and strategies play into that new, more, I guess, distributed world?
So I think there are two risks here. We could talk about them both. One is proximity bias, and the other is performing under pressure in a global environment that's faced with market headwinds and economic
Mm.
uncertainty.
Mm.
And you combine those two together, it could be an unwelcome storm. So proximity bias is natural. We tend to favor the people that we get to talk to, that we're in office with. Maybe it's around the espresso machine or the water cooler, and we're talking about what we're doing. We're talking about our successes. We're trying to demonstrate our value to the organization. But with proximity bias, we might not be as focused to a globally dispersed hybrid workforce. So those people who don't have the opportunity to come in and share their experiences and share
Yes.
their success with the teams, they might be thinking, I need to demonstrate my virtual value to the organization, especially in the face of market headwinds.
Mm.
They might be thinking, I want to keep my job. And even with the best intentions, those thinly supervised remote teams might circumvent codes, policies, and hopefully not the law. Again, not because they're looking to do something wrong, but they're looking to demonstrate their value to the organization. So I think this is a time, especially when we're working under pressure, especially where we're thinly supervised, let's pay attention to those folks who we don't get to see in front of the espresso machine and water cooler. Their needs, their risks are as equal or even greater than those folks that we get to see in the office.
That's such great advice. That's being, I guess, more intentional, more proactive in reaching out to those individuals. Let's continue on that theme. What are the signs that you see or sense in organizations that give rise to concerns? I mean, there's big ones. You can see when an individual does something potentially wrong, but you work with many organizations. What comes up is sort of, I guess, things that are starting to brew that give you a question mark around, perhaps our culture is not quite as ethical and full of integrity as it should be. What are those sort of signals and signs that come up?
Well, there's certainly mixed signals, and what I tend to characterize them as open secrets, right? So it takes a village to do something right, and it also takes a village to do something wrong. So, for example, if an organization is accelerating sales that really shouldn't be accelerated, that the client's not willing to take possession of. It's often called distribution or channel stuffing, right? It's
Yes.
the improper recording of revenue, and it's accounting fraud.
Hmm.
I engaged in it, and we still see organizations being charged and paying fines with it. So think about what it takes to channel stuff or distribution stuff. Those orders have to be entered, they have to be manufactured. There are probably people in the shipping room that say, oh, here it is, it's the last week of the month and sales are flying through the roof and we're shipping out all these goods. So think about all the people that
Fascinating.
see that going on and they're not saying anything. They're just thinking, I'm in shipping and receiving, I'm in manufacturing, I'm in sales order process, I'm a small gear in a big organization. It's not my business to say what's going on here. So the question is, if we want to address open secrets to where people speak up about things that just don't seem right, and we're not talking whistleblowing here, we're just talking about raising a concern,
Yes.
is are we empowering everybody in the workforce, from manufacturing to sales order processing to
Hmm.
shipping and logistics? Do they appreciate that they are also ethics and integrity ambassadors? And if they see something that doesn't look right, just to raise the flag and ask for help. Because I see this all the time, and I saw it with my own case. After something goes wrong, everyone says, yeah, I had a feeling that was going on.
Right. Yes.
Well, how do
Yes.
we move had the feeling to this isn't right, and I'm not going to wait till it goes wrong to say I knew about it. Let me do it now.
So let's dig into that. So imagine you're in a scenario where, thinking about our audience here, where maybe some of the audience they know that one of their colleagues, maybe a close colleague, co-worker, is acting differently from the norm. There's something up. They sense it and smell it, but they don't need to, or feel they need to at this stage, go all the way to doing a whistleblowing. What sort of strategies should they use? So they know something's up. They feel they have a sense of responsibility. They want to do something. What are their options? What could they do?
Well, I think part of that is depending on the nature and the extent of the wrongdoing. I think there's a full spectrum of options here.
Hmm.
And fortunately, most organizations are very quick to give everyone, different directions in which they can go if they see that. It's not like this is the only lane you have
Yes.
to report something that doesn't look right. So it could start with a conversation with your friend or peer and asking about the behavior that you're curious about, right? So this is about being curious, not being a bystander,
That's
and
great.
just
Yeah, that's
saying,
great advice.
I'm not sure I understand this, whether it's a transaction or any business function. But here's the thing, you can't stop there. If you're still not comfortable, if your gut is still saying, no, it still doesn't make sense, then you have to look at what are the escalations that are available to you.
Right.
That might be to a supervisor, that might be to a local compliance leader, or depending on your level of comfort, an anonymous hotline. So the good news is you have so many options now that we didn't have 10 years ago in which to approach what might be misconduct.
So many options, and the fact that you have one conversation, that's not enough in most, if not all, cases. You have to stick with it and then explore what you learned, and as opposed to thinking, I've done my thing, done. I can move on. If we take a step back and move sort of further up the organization, and you're the executive, maybe in a business unit or a country leader, or maybe on in the C-suite, and you want to put compliance more at the center of the organization. You think it's important, purposeful, and central to what I call value creation, success, and safety, to use your words. And they said, Richard, what are my first moves? So I'm talking about the aggregate in my organization. I want to move from good to great in terms of compliance. What would be one or two of the moves they should consider making? And I know this is generic, but just what would be their big moves before going into some of the detail that you referred to earlier?
So I think, excuse me, the big move is making certain that in the organization, ethics, compliance, and ethical expectations are coming out of the voice of business. So the messaging to their reports and B-level reports and all the way down into our business functions is we have resources that are here, have a question, but this is our responsibility. Because, as Amy Edmondson shares in her work, who do we go to when we have a question? We go to our supervisors, right? So when business is sharing ethical expectations, it just sounds so much louder. And then I think the other thing, and going to another book in this compliance library, is Mary Gentile, Giving Voice to Values. And you might run your teams through ethical dilemma workshops. I mean, we've all done the one and done training, right? We've watched our anti-bribery and our videos that we've clicked through the responses. I'm sure you've seen that in your career.
I had many of them, yes.
But how do we pressure test it? So what a lot of organizations that my clients have done, and these are great, is to take maybe an ethical success or failure in the organization, anonymize it, and make it into an ethical dilemma workshop.
Yes, love that.
When teens see this is something that happened here, we're not pulling it off the page of the New York Times. It's not some generic anonymized, game that we bought. This happened here. So let's break out into groups and have a writer and appoint a spokesperson. What would you do under these circumstances?
I think that's such a great idea. I mean, I've been party to, if you like, sales and pitching versions of that, where you role play, you rehearse, and so forth. But I haven't experienced the ethical part of it. Obviously, I've had the training, and I'm very proud of what my previous employer did. But that's real, because when you're trying to push things hard, unintentionally or sometimes intentionally, you can you push the boundaries too far. So it's a consideration, as opposed to I'm trying to sell a product, pitch for some work, and then this is one of the tick boxes, which I think is how many people still think of it, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's why I wore the gray blazer today, is when you put out ethical dilemmas that might not even have a right response, right? Where any choice is going to lead to difficulties, those are the best ones of all, because you're making difficult issues discussable and putting issues in front of them where there's just no apparent and clear ethical path. Yes. That's pressure testing it.
I love how you're framing. You're bringing back Jim Detter's framing on discussables and undiscussables. I think that's brilliant. So let's dig a bit deeper on that. If you're an individual in whatever role, and you have the self-awareness and self-consciousness to feel that you are close to, if not making, a decision that you think you'll regret, but you're lured into a situation. On the one hand, I say that and think you may not have the self-awareness because you're in the bubble, you're in the rush. But if you did, what advice would you give to them?
That also is a challenging question, particularly where someone might see the finish line of a project, of a goal, of an objective, and they're not quite there yet. And what another bias, I believe it's escalation of commitment, demonstrates that the closer we are to the finish line, maybe it's to that quarterly objective, but we're not quite there yet, David, the more risk we will take to get there.
Yes.
So I think for business leaders and for compliance leaders, risk lives through the life of whether it's a procurement or sales process. Very often we're very focused at the beginning of a process. Due diligence, onboarding, what's the risk of this contract? And then once it's in the house, we're on to the next problem. So I think part of this, if we want to keep people on the right side of decision making, don't give up on them once things start, because our risk can go up through a process, not down. and make sure you're keeping that proactive outreach and avoiding what Amy Edmondson calls dangerous silence, where we think no news is good news, and keep an eye on things right until everything is finished. Just risk can sneak up on us, David, and it can sneak up on us right at the end of a process if we're not careful.
Indeed, that's such good advice. You're a big fan of Amy's, aren't you? And rightly so. Rightly so. I remember leading a big transformation program where we did all the pre stuff, the diligence and approvals, but actually they introduced some various committees during the process, which I have to say, I thought, geez, do we really have to go through this? But it was around those topics. It was, has the risk profile changed? How's the team doing? Are we, from our perspective, leaking value, creating enough value? And I'm not sure it was sold in the best possible way, but I look back on it and think, actually, we made some really important decisions along the way, as you said, rather than getting close to the end and regretting something. This is brilliant. This shows that compliance is genuinely about value creation. This is about the success and safety of the organization. This is central to the organization, not this backstop or blocker or part of the bureaucratic machine, how it's, as it's often considered. Let's talk about your story and journey, because you've been open about that, and now you're obviously advising the best companies and trade bodies around the world on how to do this. And this podcast is a brilliant taster of that fantastic advice. Some people may know your story, some people may not. I'd love to have a synopsis of it, but also just give us a sense of what people can learn, because I imagine some people might think, and as we prepared for this, you might think, that's not me. I'm not Richard. I wouldn't have done that. What can they draw from your own experience? So paint the picture first and then perhaps give us a sense of the lessons from it.
So the picture is a journey from commerce to corruption to compliance. And, I spent 20 years as a sales executive, half of it in the United States and the second half of it as an international sales vice president, traveling all over the world, 250 days a year. I lived in Manchester for part of that time, and I know you're from London, so don't hold that against me, but enjoyed my 2 years.
Wonderful, I hasten to
add. And, I confronted corruption. I engaged in corruption, and due to no one's fault but my own. So I want to make it clear, this is a journey of personal accountability and personal responsibility. But I did get caught up in a number of investigations in the United States and the United Kingdom. I pleaded guilty to anti-bribery and trade law violations. When I got caught, my attitude was, I did it. Let's face justice, not delay it. And I know if I want to change the trajectory of my life, I need to deal with the consequences of 10 years of misconduct, where very bad behavior hid behind very good performance until it was too late for everyone. Right. Again, no one's fault but my own. But anyway, David, I did serve 14 and a half months in federal prison. I got home in December of 2013. And that's when I just started looking at ethics and compliance and appreciated. And I know from your work, there are a lot of people that are there to help you fix your ethics and compliance problems. There are well-resourced law firms and forensic firms and advisory firms and general practitioners. David, what I didn't see anyone talking about is, what is it like to be tasked with aggressive commercial success in high risk and volatile markets?
That's the axis. That's the nexus which I see many of my clients in, and I think that's the sweet spot. I mean, you've mentioned it 2 or 3 times there, Richard. You take full personal responsibility and accountability. So I'll ask this question. I wonder whether I should, which is, if you had your time again, and you look at the organization, what could they have helped you with? I fully, and I recognize it's all about you. You've said that, and very openly and candidly, but there will be some lessons. This is, perhaps you might want to generalize it to other organizations to make it easier, but there would have been some lessons for the organization in perhaps how they encouraged, incentivized, and so forth. What would you say? Do you mind me asking that question?
No, not at all. It's the one I had 14 and a half months in prison to think about, which is, what might have stopped this story before it started?
Yes.
And David, when you look at the first half of my career focused on the US market, and again, my firm wasn't all special or unique. Public company, listed, global operations, suite of products and services. I had public sector interaction, private sector interaction, worked with third-party intermediaries. So it's not a unique environment at all.
Mm.
But the US market tends to be rich in opportunity. And from a sales perspective, it's you win some and you lose some.
Yes.
Low in corruption risk, none, but low.
Mm.
And then I'm moving over to international sales, far and few between, but they're enormous in the scope. So it's a win big, lose big sales environment, high in corruption risk. So imagine if before I took my first flight, other than just having me sign the FCPA, so I certainly knew bribery was illegal. I signed the FCPA, which is the US anti-bribery law. Imagine if one of my business peers, and I'm talking about my supervisor, would have said, Richard, we can just say no to bribery. That's a wall poster. That's not operationalizing ethics and integrity. We want to get you prepared for the inevitable risks that you're going to face. We might even do some of the Mary Gentile ethical dilemma workshops to prepare you for what's inevitably going to happen.
Yes.
We've got legal and compliance resources here to keep you successful and safe. And we're going to pay you in a way that promotes ethical and sustainable business practices. We're not going to pay you, as I was paid, on a eat what you kill lucrative performance plan. That could point you in the wrong direction. So, Richard, if the voice of get the business done ever drowns out the voice that we always care how you get the business done, let's have this conversation again. And I think, David, if that was followed up periodically with how are things going instead of that dangerous silence, when I first confronted corruption within my first 6 months of my international work, I would have said, wait a minute, I know exactly what I need to do here. Because not only am I trained, but I'm prepared. And I've been prepared by my supervisor.
So as you were winning the business and being so successful, perhaps even surpassing your targets, were you actually challenged as to, this is great, tell me more, with whether curiosity or challenge?
David, I was the corporate hero. So I was making up for shortfalls in other parts of the organization.
Right.
And I wrote an article about this. Once you're the corporate hero, you never want to lose your corporate hero status.
No.
So in my case, success blocks scrutiny. I was increasing sales in a period where there was rapid market decline, right? So no one...
So they needed you. They really needed you.
Right. Yeah. No one said, how are you getting it done? Because if you're doing it the right way, you should be leading sales seminars for the other parts of the organization.
Do more. Just do what you do and do it more. Right.
And I think those challenges, it would have been like pulling a thread out of a sweater. If someone was asking some difficult questions, it would have come apart well before the 10 years it took for the regulators to catch up with me.
Yeah. And when you stepped into prison for the first time, if I may ask this, how, and that 14 months, I think you said, how did you manage yourself? How did you get through it?
So I did a little bit of research on the prison where I would be serving, and I read that they had a very good education department. So I said, look, I have a master's degree in foreign affairs, and most of the prison population, David, very sadly, are nonviolent drug offenders that are doing significant prison time under what were the old federal sentencing laws: 5 years minimum for marijuana, 10 years minimum for cocaine and crack. And these were inner city street kids.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And I grew up inner city. So I said, look, these are people that didn't have the resources that I had. And in as much as they want to educate themselves through what they call equivalency diplomas and English as a second language courses, I figured let's try to leave this campsite in better condition than I found it. So I spent my 14 and a half months as an educator, and hopefully gave people more of a chance when they were released from prison not to reoffend. So, I
That's
really
inspiring.
appreciate, David, that not every ex-offender gets to do what I do, which is work with clients on a global basis and share my story and run a practice. Most ex-offenders are trying to find a job, and look for housing. So it's really, even now, and I've been doing this since 2014, I still approach this with humility and
Yes,
honor.
that comes through, Richard. How do you get the balance between, if you like, portraying and promoting yourself now and who you want to be, and doing the work, because you work with organizations all around the world, speak with them, work with them, write about them, and so forth, versus the people who want to hear, as I've been hearing for a part of this podcast, about your story. And I get the fact they'll want to hear about it, but you'll want to talk about you now, right? In 2020 through and beyond. How do you get that balance right?
So the balance is, how do we take the experiences of former commercial Richard and bring them to life in a way that's relatable to the current compliance challenges? So I sort
Yes.
of wear two hats.
Mm.
And what I love about my work, David, and I'm sure you appreciate this, is all of my client work is bespoke. So I get to know about organizations that face challenges from cars to cosmetics, from oil and gas to natural resources, and, and consumer goods, everything in between. And it's really I think I'm drawing inspiration when you see organizations that really try to get it right. So the one thing I will not do is share a scared straight story, because people won't remember that. What I want to share is, you're never alone, right? You never have to take ethics and integrity into your own hands. You can always unpack challenges with your team, and let's operationalize and get these wall posters off the wall and into real
Make it real.
world
Yeah.
solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, you've given yourself a second chance. You've given other people, both within prison and second chances. And I guess other people have given you, whether it's your family, friends, colleagues, a second chance. And you talked about that eloquently. What do you think it takes to give somebody a second chance? Picture, but maybe a co-worker or a colleague who's maybe working with somebody now who's still in the organization, or perhaps they've had to leave. What do you think it takes to give somebody a second chance, or give yourself a second chance?
So I'll take that in reverse order. Giving yourself a second chance is, there's a lot of work on, I think it's The Power of Regret by
Mm.
Daniel Pink.
Yes.
Very powerful book, and a book that changed my life. And we share probably this book in our libraries, is Dory Clark, Reinventing You,
Yes.
which is a
Indeed.
series of very powerful books. I read that book in prison, and it made me appreciate that if I share my story with full transparency, the good, bad, and the ugly, to quote in a famous film,
Mm.
that I might have an opportunity to use this journey to help others.
Mm.
So the key was transparency.
Mm.
And I think that, to give people a second chance, they really have to embrace what happened. Like, if you don't take that full accountability and you try to deflect it, you're not really truly appreciating what you did.
Yes.
And maybe that's why I still talk about it, David, as I never want to convince myself that it wasn't that bad. From my family and my health, it was catastrophic, and I never want to convince myself that it wasn't. But I think once you start that journey of appreciating regret and appreciating the consequences of your conduct, then you can start on that road to rebuilding your life, and where other people, as Dory shares in her book, also might appreciate that, you know what, he or she is really turning the page. Let's see what they have to say, and let's talk about forgiveness.
That's very moving. That's very, very thoughtful. As we bring this to a close, I always ask my guests two important questions, Richard. One is, and you've alluded to this to a degree, but what impact on the world do you want to have through your work?
If there's one person, as you well described, like that person that's on the fence, facing a lot of pressure to succeed and an ethical dilemma is at hand, if one person at a time, I can get them to tap the brakes and hit the pause button and reach out to their team and unpack that problem with the group that wants them successful and safe. And I may never know. Those may be untold stories, although I do hear some of them, which that provides me with the fuel and the inspiration to do this, is knowing that I tipped one person at a time to the right direction of ethical and responsible conduct.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I'm thinking about your best days, the days when you smash it out of the park, you do your best possible work. What are the practices you use, and what are the conditions that enable that great work?
Well, I'm assuming we're talking about the current compliance, Richard, in terms of smacking it out of the park.
Indeed. Yes, indeed.
Because I was hitting foul balls as former commercial Richard all along, and hate to use the baseball metaphor too much, but nonetheless, I think that what I've learned, David, and maybe this has to do with recently turning 60 and also having, some personal challenges in my life, and, not everything is always as smiley as we like it.
Yes.
I've learned the power of reading your own energy levels, right? And not getting past them. So I try to dial in my work and exciting conversations like this, which give me energy, and say, I want to balance that with, my professional life and my personal energy levels, so that I don't end up feeling depleted, and that I'm not giving, my full self every time I'm interacting with someone. And it's not always easy admitting that, this is not the same as it was as 50-year-old Richard, and just to appreciate that, sometimes doing less can be doing more.
Oh, that's brilliant. Even though you look as sharp as ever and as dapper as ever, I hasten to add. I mean, you're being strategic with your energy and your attention.
Right.
I mean, Richard, this has been a great conversation. I find it very moving, very deep, very, very thoughtful, and I appreciate the candor you've shown with us and the audience. I've worked quite a lot in compliance, if I look back on it, and I've worked a lot in regulated industries. But what I've taken from this conversation and getting to know you over the past few years is this is about positioning compliance at the center of the organization. This is about making it systematic. This is not about the slogans, the wall charts, the training, although you need a degree of that. This is about identifying the moments, the situations, and the people who can really embed success and safety throughout an organization, and especially organizations that are more distributed and hybrid than they were before. So I take a lot from this. I'm very grateful. Where can people find out more about you and your brilliant work?
So, David, thank you. And thank you again for this conversation. Speaking personally and professionally, it's been such an honor. And your prior podcasts with Jim, with Ron, have been motivational running for me. So I really enjoy both in form and substance what you have to say, and your prior guests as well. It's easy to find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, particularly LinkedIn. Just look up Richard Bistrong. I have a LinkedIn newsletter where I'll be sure to share Lancefield on the Line, which people are welcome to subscribe to. I have e-learning series that you can look up on my website. So I think it's just a simple Richard Bistrong search on LinkedIn.
We will find you.
And
We will
I'm easy
find you.
to
You've
find.
done a brilliant job of portraying your brand, your business, your platform. You are definitely an influencer on social media in the right areas and in the right ways and with purposefully. And I've learned a lot from you. So thank you, Richard. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes, Ron, Jim, and many, many others from across the world. And if you're feeling generous, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. Feeling even more generous, give us a wonderful rating on your podcast platform of choice. Richard, thank you ever so much again.
Pleasure, David. Thank you.